Hi everyone, this is Dr. Nitin Chhoda, and in this training video I'm going to talk to you about the $30 trillion man. I'm going to talk about Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, who I think is going to be the man that will save America. I want you to mark my words, if and when we recover from this crisis, the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is going to go down as the greatest financial wizard of all time. He's going to go down as the greatest magician who pulled off a trick that the world has never seen and probably will never see again. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about the three things that really jumped out at me from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell's interview on CBS News 60 Minutes, and I'll actually link to the entire 60 Minutes video below, so I definitely think you should check out that video after you see my analysis. But before I get into that, if you're an existing subscriber, welcome back to my channel. If you're not an existing subscriber yet, then please consider subscribing below. Please smash that notification button. You can do your own magic trick for me, and you can click that like button, and if you can just pull off that magic and click that little button, I would greatly appreciate it. With that being said, let's get into the video. So here's a website called the US Debt Clock. Now, this website gives you an approximate idea of the US federal debt. As at the moment I'm recording this video training, the US federal debt is well over $25 trillion, and that number that you see in real time is actually the US federal debt increasing in the few seconds that it takes you to watch this video. It's quite incredible if you look at it. As a country, we spend more money than what we take in, and by the time the dust settles on this entire crisis, by the time all the stimulus checks are over, all the unemployment benefits are over, all the federal aid to small businesses, to big corporations, the Main Street lending program, the economic injury disaster loan, by the time all that is over, I believe the US federal debt will exceed $30 trillion. So that's how much money the US government is in debt for, because the US government spends more than it takes in. Now, there's a lot of talk about a couple of $1 trillion here, a couple of $1 trillion there, but I wanted my viewers, my subscribers, to get a sense of what $1 trillion actually looks like. This on your screen right now is a $100 bill. We're all familiar with a $100 bill. Now, let's take 100 of those bills, and this right here is a stack of $100 bills, which is about half an inch thick, which is about $10,000. I mean, it's walking around money. I'm sure you and I just walk around with $10,000 in our pocket, don't we? Now, what if we took this stack of $10,000 bills, and what if we multiplied that by 100? Then what would you get? You would get this stack right here, which is $1 million. Now, I want you to think about this. $1 million in a stack of $100 bills is the kind of money that would fit into a really small purse, if you will. It could fit into a bag that you can put your laptop in. You could easily fit $1 million in $100 bills into a backpack. So again, that's just carrying around money for you and me, I'm sure. We could go to the grocery store carrying a backpack full of $100 bills, and we could just be walking around with $1 million. I could be getting on my business class flight, and I could just, instead of carrying my laptop, just put a bunch of $100 bills, fit it all into my laptop bag, and I could probably get on a plane with $1 million. Now, $1 million doesn't really look like it's that respectable. What if we multiplied that by 100 and we took 100 of those $1 million? So what if we took $100 million? That would look like this. Now, that looks a little bit more respectable. It looks like a sort of like a stack, a pallet, if you will, that you would see at Costco. So the next time you go to Costco and you look at one of those pallets, just imagine it's filled to the brim with $100 bills, and then think of me, Nitin Chhoda, and think of my channel and the fact that you learned that a pallet at Costco, when filled entirely with $100 bills, would be $100 million. Now, let's take 10 of those pallets. Now things start to get a little bit more exciting. So when you take one pallet, which is $100 million, and you take 10 of them, which is $1,000 million, that's where you get $1 billion with a B. Now we start to look at wealth that's somewhat respectable, right? That's the kind of wealth which, if you multiply a few times over, you have guys like Jeff Bezos, guys like Mark Zuckerberg having that kind of wealth. So now that looks a little bit more interesting. That right there on your screen is $1 $1 billion with a B. So now let's talk about $1 trillion. A lot of this talk of $1 trillion here, $1 trillion there gets thrown around. So again, if you took that $1 billion and you multiply that by 1,000, you would get what is $1,000 billion or $1 million, which essentially is 1 followed by 12 zeros. So once again, we're talking about 1,000 billion or $1 million, which is 1 followed by 12 zeros. And that right there, ladies and gentlemen, is $1 trillion. Now that what you see right there, all those pallets are double stacked with $100 bills. Now, I want you to think about this. If you had to store $1 trillion, that's with a T, $1 trillion, that's 1 followed by 12 zeros, you would need several Costco's. You would probably need, in my estimate, you'd probably need 10 Costco's filled with $100 bills, top to bottom, from the floor right to the ceiling. And now I want you to multiply that by 25. That is the debt of the United States right now, and that is what we're looking at. And obviously that debt is increasing, and that's why I called the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell the $30 trillion man, because what he's looking at when all of this is behind us, it'll never truly be behind us because we'll be deeper in debt than ever before, is we're going to be $30 trillion in debt. So why did I call Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell the man who can save America? I believe there are 3 individuals right now that can save America. One is the president, with the decisions he makes and with the laws that will be signed that go from the Congress to the Senate and then have to be signed into law by the president. The second is the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, and he's the one I'm going to talk about. And also the Secretary of the Treasury. That is the individual who's ultimately responsible for the distribution of the money through our system. Because keep in mind, the Federal Reserve, also known as the central bank, which is a branch of the government, the Central Reserve can function as a lender, but it is the government, the Secretary of the Treasury, that essentially functions as a spender, the distribution and the allocation of that money. So let's talk about the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and exactly what he said about where all this extra stimulus money will come from, where the extra $3 trillion, $4 trillion, $5 trillion that have to be pumped into the economy come from. On a CBS News interview, 60 Minutes, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said, "We have the ability to create money digitally." These are his exact words. "We have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guaranteed securities." Now, what the Federal Reserve Chairman is doing is essentially creating money out of thin air by he said it himself, we create money digitally. So, when we go see a magic trick, right? The oldest magic trick in the book is pulling a rabbit out of a hat. The audience knows that it's a trick. The audience knows that there's a rabbit probably hiding in the hat or hiding in a drawer next to the magician, but yet every single time we want to see that rabbit get pulled out of the hat. We as human beings, we want to see the magic trick. We want to believe in miracles. We want to believe in a magician, especially when we need some sort of an escape, especially when we need some sort of relief. Right now, we need that magic trick. We need that magician. And let's talk strictly in economical terms, so I'm not entirely philosophical or conceptual in this video training. When digital currency, specifically the US dollar, I'm not talking about crypto or anything like that, when the US dollar is essentially invented digitally by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve now uses that money to buy bonds, to buy government-backed securities. And what that does is that signals to the rest of the market within the US and by extension the global economy that the US government will back its own assets. In other words, the bonds that you buy or the government-backed securities that you buy, if you're a foreign investor, if you're a US-based investor, they are backed by the strength of the US government. So what the Federal Reserve is doing is essentially buying assets with money that they did not have. They are buying assets with money that they simply invented. And what this does is this props up the values of the assets. If they don't do this, we could be looking at a collapse of the stock market. We could be looking at a collapse of housing prices. We could be looking at a collapse of the US dollar. So what the Federal Reserve is doing right now, and I want my subscribers to really understand this because that's what my channel is all about. My channel is all about truth and honesty and real financial data. And by the way, again, if you're not a member of our community yet, please click subscribe. please click the notification button. Also, please click the like button. That's a magic trick that you can do for me, and I would really appreciate that. But what the Federal Reserve Chairman is doing now is what I believe will go down in history as the greatest financial maneuver of all time. He is going to go down as a wizard if and when we get through this. Because if you're watching this video maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years into the future, and you look back at this time, at what happened in 2020, I am certain that we will look back and say that these are the moves that helped revive, rejuvenate, trigger, and potentially even grow the US economy further, although it may not look like it at the time that I'm creating this video training. So again, when you're looking at a magician who's pulling a rabbit out of a hat, you know that it's an illusion. You know that the rabbit didn't just come out of the hat, the rabbit was there to begin with. But in this case, what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is doing is pulling a rabbit out of a hat, and the rabbit itself is imaginary. There was no rabbit to begin with. And he's pulling the rabbit out of the hat. The whole audience will go, whoa! And then the US economy will recover. And then he'll put the rabbit, which by the way didn't exist, back into the hat. And then life will one day go back to normal. That is really the first thing that stood out at me in the CBS News 60 Minutes interview. The second thing that stood out at me was the ability to borrow at low rates. In fact, these are the exact words of the Federal Reserve Chairman. We have the ability to borrow at low rates. Notice the use of the words the ability to. If we borrow at a low interest rate, we are potentially looking at paying down our debt even faster, because all the debt that we have, the $25 trillion, which by the way, like I said, will be $30 trillion when all this is over, you're actually essentially refinancing that debt at a low interest rate. Now, it's no secret that President Trump has been a fan of low interest rates. In fact, President Trump has even talked about negative interest rates. And I've done other videos on this channel talking about negative interest rates. But really the big takeaway here is the chairman of the Federal Reserve specifically said we have the ability to borrow at low interest rates. And by that he means that if they can now refinance a debt that they have at a lower interest rate, and then the US starts to pay off those obligations, which by the way leads to point 3. His exact words are, we have the ability to service that debt, and I'm quoting him verbatim. We have the ability to service that debt, and I would say that this is the time when we can use that strength to our longer run benefit. So what he's saying is, if we can refinance all of this money at a lower interest rate, because the interest rate has been cut by who else? By the Federal Reserve. If we can use this lower interest rate to refinance our debt and we can service that debt, in other words, the US government will continue to take in money from the US taxpayer, from other sources, from duties and from other measures that bring in money into the US government. The US government can then start to pay off that debt gradually. It's almost like this. You go to a bank that owes a lot of money. The bank now lowers the interest rate at which it lends money to itself. And on top of that, the bank has the ability to, like that, invent money out of thin air. Again, if and when we get through this, and I think I should say when we get through this, because we will get through this, this is going to go down as something that was, again, the greatest financial maneuver of all time. And I know that a lot of subscribers out there are thinking this will lead to hyperinflation, this will lead to the collapse of the US dollar. I mean, feel free to worry, but I don't think that's going to happen. And I have other videos on my channel that will refute that point of view. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. I appreciate you watching and being a subscriber to the channel. If you're not a subscriber yet, please do your magic trick for me and subscribe to the channel. Enable the notifications button, smash that notification button, and please pull a rabbit out of your hat and just click that like button. It takes you a second, but for me it means the world. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next video training, and I appreciate you. And once again, I think that Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is going to be the man that saves America, and I encourage you to show your support for Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell in the comment section by saying, we support you, Mr. Powell. I support him, and I'm a fan, and I know we'll get through this, and I want you to know we'll get through this as well. Thank you so much once again. Please click subscribe, please click like, please smash that notification button, and I will see you in the next video training.